Hey everyone, we're talking about the trials and tribulations of what it means to learn art, what it means to be an artist. My name is Justin Donaldson.
I'm Grace Winstead.
And I'm Rachel Dene.
And this is the Paint and Pixels podcast. So today we are going to be talking about references. A bit of a hot topic. How do we use reference? What do we use it for? What makes good and bad reference? We're all full-time artists here, so we're going to be talking about how we use it in our practice. And let's begin. So, Grace, how do you use reference in your current practice as it is today?
So, when I'm looking for reference, I'm looking for information, basically. I want to fill in any gaps that are in my brain that I may not have. And that may be for say right now I'm doing some biz dev work. So I'm doing some development work on an old farmhouse. So I'm looking up photos in the area that I want, right? This is an Appalachian farmhouse. So I'm looking up sort of the sort of Appalachian look. I'm looking up old farmhouses. I'm looking up texture references. And what I'll usually do is I will get all my photos and I will put them in a one sort of board that I can see them on. You, Justin, mentioned a program that actually specifically would help you do that better. I've been doing it just on a separate file in Clip Studio.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for just whatever I can do to fill in those gaps in my mind to kind of build up my information. Right. So that's kind of how I currently work. Is I usually get a mood board. I'll look up stuff for lighting. If I like the way a certain scene is lit, I'll find pictures of that. I'll find items, plants, whatever it is I'm looking for that I need information on. I will make this huge board and I will have just a bunch of different images on it that I'm able to constantly refer back to while I'm creating a piece.
Nice.
So that's how I work.
Yeah. So I like to actually kind of have two groups of references.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm a primarily a landscape painter, and I do two things. So the first one is a group of references that essentially looks like the kinds of places that I want to be painting. And that might be like mountains, and I might be thinking about certain kind of shrubs. And so I'll go find pictures of these shrubs and lakes, maybe some things that have the similar lighting, kind of like you're talking about, but anything that I can get from just photography to help inform what I'm doing. Because I quite often, if I don't use reference, then I'm basically just going to be getting into the things that I maybe habitually do, relying on my own visual library, which is a great thing to do, but it's not comprehensive. I always want to be extending my visual library. So that's the first one, is this group of reference that's all about real world. What do I want this to look like? The second group of reference is about the finished painting quality of it. So, this will often come back to one or two or three separate artists that when I'm thinking about what the quality of my painting is going to look like, I think, I really wanted to have this kind of effect that they achieved, or that kind of effect that they achieved. And it doesn't actually have to be the thing. If I'm painting mountains, it doesn't have to be mountains.
Yeah.
It just is like the painting quality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like these two things. One of them is the real world. One of them is how other people have interpreted and communicated with their art, so that I can always have that in mind. Because I find that if I, just like I said before, talking about the real world references and the fact that my options are far greater than what I normally think of. Even the options of the finished quality of the paint itself is often greater than I would naturally think of. And so it's all about sort of extending my options for myself and continually learning while I'm painting in order to make just a better painting. How about you, Rachel?
Well, I do pretty similarly to how Grace does, where I'm using it for filling in blanks. Ideally, I will get everything I can out of my own imagination and memory first, because usually that's where my inspiration starts, is something I know I love.
Right.
And then I'll realize There are certain things I have no idea what they look like. Usually it's like random like objects. I'll be like, wait, I have no idea how like the spout of a tea kettle is shaped at the very end or something. And so I go and look up very, very specific references.
Right.
And then I'll also, if there's like a type of lighting effect that I'm not completely sure of, I'll find that. And it could be, like you were saying, it might not have anything to do with what I'm actually working on. It's just
Right.
like, I just need like that. I'll have an idea. Like I want it to go from like blue to orange or something. And then I'm like, but what exactly would that look like? I also have recently, since I've started trying to get my values really nailed at the beginning,
Yeah.
I realized, wait, like I can hide all kinds of fun things
Yeah.
in those value like shapes without distracting.
Yes.
So I'll get anything I have in my head out, and then I go and I like this last one that I've been working on. I was like, I want to put some snails in it. And I just was thinking of like a snail, you know? And then I go and Google snails and I'm like, oh my God, there's so much cool stuff. And I ended up adding like a mama snail with a bunch of little babies. It was so much more interesting. But it was like still originally, I knew what I wanted. I didn't get lost like garden animals,
Right.
you know? So
you're talking about getting lost. Is that something that you've experienced before? When it comes to like building reference and working your way through it?
I mean, that was the original reason. Like I've only recently started using reference like reliably because I used to, every time I tried, I'd either get stuck working from like one reference because I wasn't quite sure how to combine multiples.
Yes.
Or I would get completely lost like on Pinterest, like, oh, this is such a cool idea. Oh, but that's a cool idea. And then by the end of it, nothing was like, the original idea was completely gone.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got to a point where I was like defensive about like, I don't like reference. It's like not imaginative. Ever since I figured it out, I'm like, oh, how did I ever not use it? It makes your art so much better.
It's true. Yeah, I really like that idea of kind of like starting out with whatever you're thinking, like your imagination, whatever you're wanting to paint. And at that point, not necessarily using reference at all, right? Like just coming up with the ideas. And and then once you kind of have something really solid, then at that point going out and finding a reference, ways to like enrich and make what you're doing more effective and more beautiful, but still retaining that idea of what are you doing. You know, we talked last week about having you know, we're communicating with our art where we have something we want to say with it. And like you, I remember points in times where you're like, oh, I'm going to do this thing. And then you go find reference. And then by like, you know, an hour, 2 hours later, that thing you wanted to do is no longer the thing that you wanted to do at all. It's just changed completely. And then but the real problem with that is that you're still adding into this same thing that now has like 5 or 10 things it wants to say instead of one thing it wants to say. And because it's saying 10 things, it's basically saying nothing.
And I just remembered a big reason of why I used to not use reference, and I'm not sure when it changed.
Okay.
I used to go in, and if I knew what I was looking for, and I was looking for other art that was similar, I got like, what's the word? Like deflated.
Jealous? Oh, deflated. Okay.
I don't know. Like you realize your idea has been done in some version and it's been done beautifully, and you start to think like, well, wait, this isn't even original. Like. You lose your steam after if you're just kind of vaguely searching for similar ideas, like I was. And so like now since I'm searching really specifically, it's not so much
right. You have the thought of like, oh, I can't do this because someone else has already done it.
Like, that's not what I want. So it's okay. Like,
oh, okay. Now you're like able to put it down. Is that what you're saying?
I think things changed when I started to realize that my idea didn't have to be super unique and precious, and this painting did not have to be the end-all be-all masterpiece. I just needed a fun idea that I loved, and then I'm going to finish it. Like I'm going to get that idea out, and it is what it is. And if there's a million other ideas. They can be in a different piece.
Yeah. So can we talk about that for a minute? So it's this idea of like originality. And I remember when I was young and just like naive going through, there was this mindset at school where you had to be original. And anything
Mhm.
that wasn't original was evil, terrible. It was
Yeah.
like you're doing the wrong thing here. You have to do something original. And so I kept that mindset, and I think I still see it everywhere. But there's actually a couple of problems with that. We're conflating the idea of originality with the idea of creativity.
Yeah.
So to extend that a little bit further, originality is like there's nothing has been like this before. There's nothing out there that is exactly like what it is that you've done. And
I don't think
that,
exists, in my
that
opinion.
doesn't
I think
exist.
everything has been done in a million different
Everything.
ways.
And yeah, absolutely. So everything has been done. There really is no originality, and to me, to my younger self, that was really deflating.
Hmm.
But it's also like this relentless pursuit for something you can't achieve,
Hmm.
and it was held at such a like a high value that we're coming back to references. That talk about references. It it creeps into this idea that you can't use references.
Yeah.
Like you can't do it. You can't steal ideas. You can't trace. And when I'm saying stealing ideas, I don't mean making someone else's painting exactly like they've made it, right? But just like there's so many good things we can take from other people's ideas that just so for example, like so that we're on the same page here, I can take lighting from uh, somebody's portrait and I can put it onto a different portrait, and the portrait I put that lighting onto looks nothing like the original portrait. And so you can say, well, that's not original. No, but it's very effective in saying what it is that I want to say, like it's it's about finding things that are communicating what you're communicating in ways that you don't have access to otherwise, and being able to apply that to something that is different, which is where creativity comes from.
And
So,
the way that you are going to be as original as you ever can be is those choices that you make. Like when I go and
right.
I want to say I want to light a specific scene a very specific way to bring in a certain mood, right?
Yes.
I'm going to go look up, and I like a lot of cinematic lighting, so I'm going to look up what sort of cinematographers and filmmakers have done. I'm going to look at what photographers have done. I'm going to be looking for like that, like this lighting, and I'm going to bring that to my painting. And that's a choice that I made, that somebody else may have made a totally different choice. But the fact that I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm sort of
exactly
using sort of like figuring out through what they've already figured out, that choice that I made is unique to me. You know what I mean? Just because they lit
Absolutely.
their scene that way and I say my scene could use that same kind of lighting, that's not, you know what I mean? Mine's still going to turn out totally different. It's still going to turn out like, because I'm going to have a million other choices that I'm making too. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that's the closest to originality we're ever going to get, is all those, those choices that we make are only ever going to come from us.
Right. And that comes back to as saying we're conflating the idea of originality with the idea of creativity and pretending that those two are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what you're talking about is creativity. Creativity being where you combine two things,
Yeah.
at least two things that don't normally live together.
Mm-hmm.
That's when we're being creative. And so we say like, instead of painting a human head here, I'm going to paint a mushroom. Hey, that's really creative. Is it original?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, if it was unoriginal, no one could relate to it.
Yeah.
There's this whole idea in designing, industrial design, where you kind of have the 80-20 rule. Like 80% of what it is that I'm designing has to be intuitive for people. And then that 20% is where you can be creative and change things. Otherwise, people have no idea what it is they're looking at.
Actually reminds me, the other day I was watching a video on references, right?
Uh-huh.
And someone in the comments had said, I always thought of it as you wouldn't expect a cook to like not. You wouldn't think that a cook was wrong for using a cookbook,
Right.
right? And then of course my little brain goes like, yeah, well, chefs, they add their own little touch. Well, that's sort of what creativity is. Like you're saying, it's okay to kind of use like a guide and then add your own touch.
Ingredients is kind of like what it is. That's how I look at it. Is I'm taking
switch out some things. Exactly.
Different sources.
Use what you got. One of the biggest hurdles to me using reference was when I first worked through your course.
Okay.
And everyone was using the same references.
Right.
And no one's work turned out even close.
Yeah, exactly.
And it didn't matter on skill level. You could have like 5 paintings, all gorgeous, like really well done. They all feel so different.
Right.
Like it's about, to me at that point, I was like, oh, it doesn't matter. If we are all using the exact same painting, it all is going to feel different. And actually have a style. Like that class is also the reason I was like, I'm not caught up on style as much anymore because I'm like, everyone has a style. They
right. Whether you think you do or not.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's another episode. But the reference is not going to control you as much as you think unless you are just absolutely after realism. Right.
And well, that brings us kind of to what we were talking about before about communication. The fact that we're actually trying, like, we're trying to do something with this. If you're not actually like aiming for anything, then your piece will look like what it is you're looking at, like one for one. And at that point, we're not, that's where the creativity maybe has died a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I would say, so I'm a landscape painter. I remember this one time I went to a friend, his name is Dane Cousins, and he lives, I went to stay with him, and he's a marvelous painter. You guys should look him up. And I was talking to him about the artists that I like, some of my favorite artists. And I was kind of sort of bemoaning, like my lack of skill compared to them. And then he says, well, you're trying to do this kind of imaginative stuff where you're literally just making things up. But all of these people that you really like, they're literally going to a place and they're painting what they're seeing. And I was like, oh, wow. Like, yeah, there's a huge difference in that because they're using direct reference. Like they're standing there looking and so there's a difference. And there's, for me as a landscape painter, I love going outside and painting, and what I paint's never going to be the same as exactly what I see by the time it's done because the lighting is different. Like everything's different by the time I'm done. And so you have to make these choices that are informed by what I see in front of me. But because the lighting is so different from what it was, I kind of have to fit it into what I've been working on, which you take that into, even making imaginative work. Really, how often is a reference that you find actually going to fit like exactly into what it is that you do? So I'd like to talk about that for a minute, some of the hardships about actually using reference. Maybe let's start with the question, what makes good reference and bad reference?
So for me, what makes good reference, whatever gives me that information that I'm looking for. So it's kind of totally dependent. Like if it's an anatomy sort of thing, like let's say I'm wanting to draw, because I do a lot of character art, and let's say I'm like, well, crap, I don't know how this is going to foreshorten this way, or I don't know like what the hand's going to do in this particular pose or whatever. A lot of times I'll actually just get photos. So I'll just get my husband, I'll be like, get a picture of me doing this or whatever. So for me, a bad reference is such a crappy answer, I feel like, but it's kind of one that's incomplete as far as that information that I'm looking for, whatever that gap is. I feel like that's such a crappy answer.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
Because it informs the way that you're, like, you have to use the reference in a certain way. Because I know a lot of people when they're first out and they try to use reference, they really just try to use that information one for one. They're going to put the color in the same as they see. They're going to put like the values, the lighting scenario.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is it's like, what is that problem that I'm trying to fix? And
exactly. That's the information. And so like a lot of the time when it comes to finding interesting things, like I'm not even actually using that reference to make exactly the same shapes, or
Mhm.
like I'm looking at it from a slightly different angle. I have to actually use all of the other skills. Like
Yeah.
reference isn't easy to use reference well. You
Mm-mm.
have to use all of your normal art skills. And so it's and the times and places that you see reference used bad, it's because they're copying
Mhm.
every detail instead of the important details, and then translating into, okay, that's good. How can that actually fit into my art?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And on in talking about like using it one for one, there are actually people who use reference really closely and at the same time make good art. And
Mhm.
most of the time that they do that, it's by kind of like I'm thinking about an artist that I know called Howard Lyon, and his really fantastic. And what he taught me was that if you want your art to be better, get better reference. So he brings a model in and he gets the lighting exactly the way he wants. And essentially what he's doing, and he'll Photoshop everything in. Essentially what he's doing at that point is he's constructing the entire painting
He's
so
making all
that
the creative choices before he ever paints, basically.
exactly, that's exactly what he's doing, when that person is there. But man, I can tell you lighting, if you're going for copying something in order to create a painting, which is perfectly fine practice. There's nothing wrong with that. Getting your lighting just right so that your photograph looks like a painting already, it changes everything. Some of the artists that I know, the difference between them and the professional artists that they want to be is the fact that their professional artists are setting things up right from the beginning. And that if those artists who are really struggling to make that last little leap, if they only put in that effort, but it's not even just effort, it's understanding what makes a good picture,
Mhm.
but doing it in that fluid state of being able to just to say, well, okay, turn around and we're going to move that light over here, and get it so that it looks right from the beginning. And that was a huge, mind blown time for me, because it just gave me this glimpse into, really what are some of the differences. This podcast is brought to you by my online painting courses. Now, whether you want to learn to paint landscapes in any medium, to figure out how gouache works, to work your way through form and rendering to make your paintings pop and feel lifelike, or you want to learn how to make hand-painted anime backgrounds, I have exactly what you need. My goal is to help you become a proficient and confident artist, and I'm really excited to see that happen. Now, you can find these courses in the link below, and I can't wait to share everything I know with you. But for now, let's get back to the podcast.
I know that Norman Rockwell works a lot that way. If you look at his old stuff, you could tell he would hire models and he'd get everything perfectly set up and he'd get his photos and stuff. And if you look at sort of references that he would create to the finished paintings, you could tell that he was making so many of those creative choices well before he ever started drawing or painting anything. I think Andrew Loomis, in a lot of his books, he talks about that. He'll hire models, or he would hire models, and you could see his photos and stuff that he would work from and stuff. And you could tell that very much like what your friend is doing.
Yeah, and at the same time, you can also see, when you get when the photo right next to the end result painting, so much of it is the same. And then there's a whole bunch of differences as well. At the same time as being really careful to get the references right.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not a trap. It's not a trap that says, no, it has to be exactly this way. You can continue to develop the painting, because the painting is never done until it's done.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So here's another question. What tools do you use to find or create good reference? Let's start with that one, because I have some answers up front. One of them is Sketchfab.
Yes.
This might date itself eventually, but at the moment there's a website that's essentially for 3D models, and it's to sell 3D models. And so the website has built into it the capability to actually show these, and you could rotate it and slightly change the lighting and stuff like that. And it is amazing for just being able like go there and say, look, I'm looking for a hand. So you put it in hand,
Mhm.
and like, 50 different 3D models of hands turn up, and then you can sort of, rotate it and zoom out to exactly where you need it to be. And then, like we're talking about, use that good reference and but adopt it into what you're doing. Um, so I use that. I do use Google image search.
I do too.
Again, there's no problem with that until you start to try and just copy directly from
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Like somebody else's painting. I like to challenge myself to say, like, me in 5 years after I like really don't have the memory of this particular time of searching for this reference, could I use the reference? Can I look at the reference and look at my painting and not necessarily make the connection that I used it?
Yeah.
Well, that brings us into the question maybe of how much is too much. When are you going from just using reference to, like, at this point you're stealing somebody's work?
I think, I always see it a lot. Like a lot of people love to they'll find these beautiful photos and stuff on Pinterest and stuff. And you'll see where they'll just like straight up copy them and stuff. And
Yes.
and then they'll just be like, photo found on Pinterest. And I'm kind of like, I always feel like kind of, if you like, I understand a lot of times, you're learning and stuff, and they're probably not making any money off this piece of art or anything. But I'm like, but that photographer is an artist too. And
Right.
he made all those choices, and a photographer, and a lot of times like did a lot of work in post processing. You know what I mean? And so I kind of feel like if you're just basically finding these beautiful photos that not only did they, set everything up perfectly before they, shot it, then on top of that, they go into Lightroom or Photoshop and all their places, and they do tons of post-processing. And I know all this because my husband's kind of like a hobbyist photographer. So I know, there's so much work that goes into like photography, even just after the photo is taken. And I'm always just kind of like, if you're just straight up just copying this exact photo and then just like, oh, I found it on Pinterest, you're not crediting the photographer or anything. I don't know. I'm always a little iffy on that, because I'm like, well, that guy's an artist too. And I don't know how I'd feel if like somebody took one of my paintings, straight up copied it, and was just like, oh, some artist made it. And I don't know, no credit, you know what I mean? I'm just like, I never know how to feel about that. I'm just like, I don't know. Like, I get most people are doing it to learn, but still. So.
Yeah, it's funny. You can sort of go around on Instagram, and it basically gives you like the top 100 Pinterest things right now, just because you see these paintings and you're like, oh, I know where they got that one from. Oh, I know where that's from. Oh, I've seen that one before.
Yeah.
Because I definitely use Pinterest for searching for things, for looking for things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the real difference comes back to the idea that Danae was talking about before, actually having a creative vision before you find the reference.
Yes.
And the reference is only there to help inform what you already have as a creative idea.
Well, it's in the name, reference, like like a frame of reference. It's for stuff you don't have. It's
exactly
right.
You are referencing it because it's not in your head. I was going to say, like, you can look at my little reference boards and it almost looks like I intentionally avoid pretty reference. Like, I didn't thought about it before, but I think I might, because like if someone has a really beautiful photograph where they've added a bunch of their own creative flair, I think that that'll end up seeping into my idea, which would be okay if that's what I was originally looking for, but if it's not. So like a lot of my references are like just straight up ugly. They could be, oh, sorry, I dropped something. They could be like a botanical sketch. It's like, okay, I'm doing an orchid painting for someone. I have never looked at an orchid up close.
Sure.
I just haven't. I've never owned one. And so now I'm like, wait, it was like, I could draw you a dandelion with my eyes closed. Like, what does their stem look like? What? I have no idea. And at first I was just looking on like Pixabay, where you've got your free to use references. But because I have no reference in my mind I'm just
right. What's
end up copying it.
Right.
I don't know. So I started to get a whole bunch of like botanical drawings. I'm like, okay, so at least now I have enough backlog information where I'm like, I can make a stem look like a cylinder at any shape. I can, add the shadows where they need to go. That's just the foundation, right?
Yeah.
So it really is just filling in the parts that I don't know. I think that's if you can stick to that kind of idea for most of your reference, you're not going to end up copying anything.
Yeah.
Right. There are times and places where I see a photo or a painting and I'm like, I am sad I did not take that photo. Like, I am sad I didn't make that painting,
Yeah.
and I want to make that painting. And in those times, I have to be very, very careful. But what I do is essentially, I want to isolate the thing that actually makes me like it.
Yes.
Like, and what I know I'm not going to do is actually use this photo for reference when I'm doing it, right? So like I'll see it and I have in my head like this beach scene with these giant rocks coming out. It's amazing. So what do I like about it? I like some of the shapes, and I like some of the atmosphere. And so I take the shapes in the atmosphere, and then I take it back to that first step of, okay, let me like get rid of the reference and start picturing what this is going to look like as a painting that really, once I've taken these one or two qualities out, has nothing to do with the other one. And then I make sure not to use that for a reference again. I go look for other reference. I make a couple of different sketches about what this might look like, so that what I'm doing is continually developing the painting. And in that way, you can use other people's work as a jumping point for creativity, but it kind of really has to still be my ideas and what it is that I want out of this painting, and transforming it, because it's really probably not going to look like what it is that inspired the first person in the first place. And so kind of continuing to develop those ideas. And if you just take the things that you liked about it, and that might just be like the shape of a tree, but then I look for reference to find similar or different trees, and I like bring all of these ideas together. We're coming back to creativity, and taking ourselves out of the realm of copying something else.
I put reference away
Yes.
after I absorb the bit that I don't have.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, and I don't think I could have done this a couple years ago, but because I sort of have gotten comfortable with the way that I paint and this, I guess you could call it style. I hate that as a trigger word almost, but if you can recognize what you need, go find it, lock it in, and then come back with like your own style without looking at it. I think it's such a smooth process of just not having to rely on your own visual memory bank. What would you call it?
Visual library.
Yeah, which is so important to build, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So one this is related, but it's a tangential at first. One thing that I do use to find reference, because I am a landscape painter, is I like to use Map Crunch, which is essentially Google Earth with a couple of different features in it. It's called mapcrunch.com. And so it allows you to sort of go around and find all of these Google Earth things. And this will happen with a lot of landscape artists, is, we do work relatively sort of from reference. It happens a lot, and it makes a lot of sense to do that. But in doing that, there's always a point where if you continue to copy what you see, your painting gets worse.
Yeah.
And I'm always telling this to students, is that at some point, and probably actually at many, many points, you need to put your reference away, stop using it, and start asking yourself the questions, not of like, what is the reference doing, but what does my painting need? And those don't always end up being the same thing. And a lot of people get stuck in their ability to paint, in making a painting. And I'm thinking a lot about landscapes, but also like big scenes where you have to be able to step back and essentially be things like, well, where's the highest point of contrast? Like, what's drawing my attention? What is not drawing my attention, but I want it to? And you have to start asking yourself these questions without looking at the reference, because the reference is going to do what the reference does. I like the phrase that nature is under no obligation to communicate, because it's not trying to say anything. It's not trying to feel anything. It just is. But as artists, we're here to say things, to feel things, to really be in ourselves, in our heads, in our hearts about what it is that we're doing. And that requires us to like, from time to time, put away the reference. Um, Oftentimes there's a little exercise where spend 10 minutes looking at a reference and drawing from reference, and then put it away, and then spend 10 minutes just thinking functionally like that. Like, what does the painting need? What is going to help stand out the things that I need to stand out, and what things do I need to tone down? And then go back to the reference for another 10. Like alternating between kind of this logical object, real world kind of thinking, and then the like pictorial, I'm actually making a painting here, and what serves the painting best kind of thinking. And I find that opens up the students to a lot of it helps them push past a lot of the places that they get stuck.
I try to do that with my studies. So like about
Yes.
the only time that I ever find myself anymore just like copying anything is if I'm like, I want to do a study, right? So I've been working on a bunch of my own stuff for a while, and I'm at this point where maybe I'm burnt out, or maybe I'm art blocked and I'm like, no ideas. And I'll be like, well, I'll do a study, right? So maybe it's a master study, or maybe it's a film study or whatever. And so a lot of times with my studies, I'll sit down and I usually don't, unless it's like a master study and I'm specifically trying to like, even then I don't usually copy. I'm usually like find one thing from them that I'm like, I like the way they do that. And I try to, but when I do like a film or master study, a lot of times they're stylized. Sometimes they're not. But even then, I'll usually try to at some point stop looking at it. You know what I mean? And kind of just, I even will do that with my studies. And I actually notice I do more interesting studies when I eventually will kind of set it aside and kind of look at it as my own and see like, okay, what can we do here kind of thing. So
Yeah. Yes. So I feel like a lot of times that somebody just copies what they see right in front of them. You essentially end up stamping out any sense of gesture at all.
Yeah. Oh,
you
yeah.
know, like any sense of the broad strokes, the bigger picture. It tends to leave those paintings pretty quick.
Yes.
Then you're just one for one copying what it is that you see. Yeah.
I think the brain also gets in that copy mode. You know what I mean? At least mine
Yeah,
will.
for sure.
Mine will definitely, if I start copying, it's like I have to work to get out of that mode, because my brain's like, okay, well just copy what you see. And it's hard, for at least for me, to like get out of that mode of just straight up copying what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and well, I want to make sure that we're communicating that there's a really good time and place for copying.
Yes.
There's so many really good skills that you can really only develop by, like learning to mix a color to get it where I want it to be requires that I'm copying a color. I'm looking at something I'm seeing. And there are so it's not wrong in and of itself, but art tends to always be about kind of alternating between different kind of states of mind or different ways of working through a thing. And thinking functionally about what a painting or a drawing needs is definitely an alternate state from just copying that we kind of need to make sure it gets in there. Otherwise, it gets a bit rough.
I think it's also easier, at least for me, at least on my art journey, the copying always came easier than the you know what I mean? Like my brain, the thinking about like, okay, well, I'm learning, I'm copying. That one was always easier for me to understand process than the sitting down and like, what does my painting need, and the communication and the stuff, you know what I mean? So for me, I think that's why at this point I worked so hard to work on those other skills, because for so long I was just like, okay, well, I need to make it real, or I need to be able to make it like the lighting's got to be perfect and perfectly realistic, and it's got to look like what I'm seeing kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I think it's, especially when you're just beginning, there should be no shame at all in working your way through that. The bad part really just comes from saying that you did something that really somebody else did, and you copied it.
I think I use most of my references as a study of sorts.
Yeah.
I try to use them. I try to use them so that in the future I won't have to look for them again.
Yeah.
If it's the same subject. Like I think it all comes back to understanding.
It does.
Like if I learn how to light I'm looking at something. If I learn how to light a shiny tomato,
Yeah.
right? Then if I ever have to light another shiny red sphere, I shouldn't really particularly need to look that up again.
Right. And so there are people who will try to tell you that you shouldn't use any reference at all. And my personal opinion on that is that that does not exist.
I can't imagine that because, like, I use real life as a reference. I don't know about you guys, but I
Exactly.
pay attention to everything. Like, I'm like, about like probably half of my learning about light has been real life reference for me. Just like, I just sit and I just pay attention. Like, I was in the shower the other day and I was paying attention to the like freaking reflections of the bottles on my skin. You know what I mean? I'm paying attention to everything. And like, that's real life reference to me anyway, you know?
I'm pretty sure I spent majority of my childhood sitting, not communicating with anyone, and just staring at things, being like, how does the light do that?
Yeah.
Where,
Yeah.
where did the
Exactly.
shadows go? Like just these observational questions that 100% are just about painting in
Mhm.
my head, and following that. But that's the only way I can do it now is because I paid that attention before.
Yes.
I literally did a study of the lighting on my bathroom wall this morning.
Yes.
I do. I all the time, and I've for years. I think like half the reason, maybe even more than half. Maybe 75% of the reason that I understand light so well is I just pay attention to it all the freaking time, and I have for years and years and years. It's just something I
Yes.
do. And you know what's the difference? That's just information. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's actually really. I think it's a bit insidious, this idea that there shouldn't be references, because people will point to artists who don't use reference. So I'm thinking Kim Jong-gi, right? This guy he draws, and he draws from his memory or his imagination, and they're like, I shouldn't have to use reference because look at that guy, he's not using reference. When the truth is, he's been using reference for 40 years,
Yeah.
and like his reference is just every single time his drawing, looking, seeing things. And so it's no surprise that having used reference, just like you said, you learn how to draw a tomato, then next time you don't have to look it up necessarily. um, when you see somebody drawing without reference, it's not that they don't have reference, it's that they have spent a crazy
It's
amount
within
of
your
time.
brain. You know what I mean? That all of that information. It's like I
Yes.
don't use a lot of anatomy reference anymore. It's more often than not, most of the figures I draw are from imagination. But I would never ever tell anybody not to use or learn anatomy or use anatomy reference because for years I have. And for
Yeah.
years I've studied the figure and I've paid attention. Like I'm constantly, I'll sit there and like pay attention to the way my husband's hands and shit. Like I pay attention to everything. It's just that shit, that stuff is in my brain now. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
that's all it is. I think any artist that doesn't use reference, I'm sure at some point did. You know what I mean? It's in their brain now.
Exactly. And so it's never the case of somebody not using reference. It's the case of somebody either already having the reference because they've looked it up, they've spent their time observing and studying and working their way through it, or they find something new or they want to do something new and then they need reference.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's reference was involved every single time, whether it happened because now it's in their visual library or because they had to look it up. Like that's the
Mm-hmm.
only difference.
Well, you can't create something if you don't have the information there. Your brain can't pull something out of nothing. You know what I mean? You
Yeah.
you need that reference, whether it's real life or photos or other artists, whatever you're using to learn from to get that information. But if you don't have it in your brain, you got to get it from somewhere.
I like this other phrase that that familiarity is the enemy of understanding,
Mm-hmm.
which in practicality, what that means is you're like, oh, I can draw a cat. There's nothing wrong with a cat. I should be able to draw a cat. I've seen
You
cats.
sit down
I
and
know
draw a cat.
there are
It's
cats
like,
every-
what is
It's the worst thing you ever drawn ever. And just because you're familiar with it, you
Yes.
think you understand it. And so you
Mhm.
get a lot, I find this happens to me as well, but I see a lot of students get really disappointed in themselves
Mhm.
because they have these expectations that come from people who have put in a lifetime of work
Mhm.
studying reference, or they expect themselves to understand something just because they're familiar with it.
Yeah.
But and so this like intentional studying of reference that you can go from the place of being familiar with something to the place of like actually understanding it. And it's a
Mhm.
difficult process.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, and then like I've seen like artists like James Gurney and stuff, and he makes like little like I've seen him make little towns and statues and stuff, and he lights
Yeah.
them. He goes really far. It's really cool to see.
Yeah. I don't do a great deal of that myself, but I
I
certainly know
don't
somebody
either.
who does.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, Danae.
Oh, well, I actually just started it because I love to watch people make little sculptures out of junk.
Yeah.
And I realized, wait, I can use that myself. And so I'll, especially for things that need specific lighting, I'll take
Yeah.
some clay. I like polymer clay because it doesn't harden in the air. So you can just keep a little ball next to you. And if you're like, oh, I want a certain shape, it's twisty, you can just like really quick roll it out, do it. Got a lighting reference.
That's
Or
cool.
paper. I showed Justin, one of the first things I showed him years ago was um, you can crumple paper up and then kind of flatten it back out, and it'll have these little faces to it. Like,
Yeah.
and you can light that, and it'll kind of give you an idea of like if you were going to do a rock or a mountain of different like faces,
that's
the lighting,
cool.
right? Right.
Yeah.
It's so simple. It does not have to be nearly as complicated as
You
James
also
Gurney's.
you also made another really, really cool one. I was working on something for Blizzard, and so you made one of the buildings.
Yeah.
The iconic buildings.
That one was
And
pretty cool.
I was doing it so you could see the building, the whole painting idea of the painting, so that you could see the building, and we're looking kind of across a lake towards it. And so there's just kind of reflected quality. And so you made the building and then put it on a mirror so you could see that reflection underneath. Super useful, very, very
Yeah.
helpful.
I was trying to figure out how to do that. I said, well,
Just make
might as
it.
well. And I don't know if the reflection is exactly the same as it would be in water, but it's definitely better than just trying to invent it from your head.
It's the same as it would be in water if the water was like perfectly still.
Yeah.
But then you can
fast.
change things up from that point. Because really
But see, now you know from observing that reflections kind of get stretched out, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the combining. That's
right, yeah.
that's
Combining
filling
the
in
reference.
what you don't know with what you do know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So reference is quite a big topic.
It's a tool.
I'm sure that there's more to do, but yeah, it's a tool, and it's not a substitute for skill. It's not a substitute for anything. Like we said earlier, like I actually kind of think to actually use reference well, you need the rest of the skills of art, and so you can't just like
No,
to really
totally
grab that
agree.
reference and put it in so that it works, so that it's functional, so it's helpful. Requires a lot of skill.
Mhm.
But I definitely, there should be no shame at all in using reference.
No. Like you have to have that information to be able to create stuff, and you need to have that information in your visual library. And reference is just another great way to fill in whatever gaps you need to fill in so that you can communicate as effectively as you need to.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah. Don't do yourself a disservice and skip out on all that new information just because you think someone might recognize, oh, they saw this somewhere.
Right.
Just use it.
All right. With that, I think we're going to leave you guys out, and yeah, we'll see you later.
Bye, guys.
Bye.